Good afternoon and welcome to the Combating Fungicide Resistance webinar 2022, organised by Farmers Weekly and Corteva Agriscience. My name is David Jones from the Farmers Weekly Arable team, and I'm joined by crop experts and growers for this event. Over the years, we've seen a number of diseases becoming less sensitive to fungicides and therefore more difficult to control in the field. And one of the main concerns is controlling Septoria in wheat, where some fungicides are becoming less effective. This afternoon, we're going to look at how a number of diseases are becoming more difficult to control with fungicides. But as wheat is our biggest crop by area and Septoria its biggest disease problem, there will clearly be time spent on Septoria control. We have two new fungicides launched in the last few years to control Septoria, namely Univoc and Revastar. So there may well be discussion around these two products and also the future role of multi-site fungicides. The flip side of these new products is that we have lost some older products such as chlorthalonil, epoxiconazole, and there are doubts over how long tebuconazole will last. And the problem with there for the farmers, obviously, are they were cheap and very effective products. So today we're joined by four speakers. John Fraser, the Inatrek Active principal biologist from Corteva, and Inatrek is the new active fungicide developed by Corteva, and it's used in Univoc. Next, we have Hampshire farmer Julian Gibbons who has used some of these new fungicide products on his wheat. Then Dr. Aoife O'Driscoll, crop protection and agronomy specialist at NIAB. And last but no means least, Nick Anderson, head of crop technology at Velcourt. So a little bit of housekeeping. After the presentations, we will open up the event for discussion and put some of the already posted questions we received and some of your own questions. Audience members can ask a question at any time. Just type them into the box at the foot of your screen, and then I'll direct them to the panel. The webinar is expected to last for about an hour and a half, and afterwards it will be available on demand, and you will get an email to let you know when the recording is ready for viewing. If you're watching this webinar live, to get your basis CPD point, please type your membership number beginning with 200 in the Ask a Question box below. So that's enough preamble from myself. So let's go to our first speaker, John Fraser, who is the principal biologist at Corteva. And John will be looking at the principles behind mitigating resistance risk and extending the life of new fungicides. So over to you, John.
Thanks so much, David, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Fraser. I'm with Corteva Agriscience, and I've been involved with the development of Inatrek fungicides since we first looked at it in 1997. So that just shows you how long it takes to, or it can take to, develop a new active to the market. Next slide, please. So the key principle, really, when we're looking at what our disease potential is really the disease triangle. And very simply, this looks at the impact of the favorability of the environment for encouraging disease, your susceptibility of the host, your virulence of the pathogen, and in effect, what you are looking to do is to disrupt any one of these sides of the triangle, and you can do that by focusing on where your environment is. So, for argument's sake, if you're over in for Septoria control, if you're over in the west of the country, then rainfall is higher, and the likelihood of getting Septoria is higher. If you have a very susceptible cultivar, again, you're basically having an issue with the disease developing, and also the virulence of the pathogen. And if we close off that triangle, then we're really increasing the likelihood of resistance that can develop. And really the key message from this is the fungicide timing is critical, but also use the correct dose according to your conditions. So next slide, please. Look, one thing I have to say is we have a perceived wisdom to mitigate resistance risk, and over the years this has certainly changed. Now IPM is obviously the basis for resistance management, and its resistance management is a key principle of IPM. We should look to maximize the use of multi-site fungicides as mixture partners, but they need to be tailored, and their application needs to be tailored to the specific situation. And that's really also looking at the timing of application and the position within the program, which is absolutely key. So really a multi-site could be looked upon as being used earlier in the program and looking to use it as a circuit breaker. Limiting the numbers of treatments of a single site mode of action is predicted now to extend the effective lifespan of an active. And this is certainly a decision we took at Corteva with Inatreq. We originally were developing with a view to having more than one application on the label. We then took the decision to reduce that down to just one application of a picolinamide containing fungicide moving forward. And I have to say that was no easy task, because in effect we were cutting our sales potential by, let's say, 20 to 80%. One key aspect that's really come out over recent years is low dose rates of fungicide do not increase risk, but high doses do increase the resistance risk. Now that goes against really what has been said in previous years, where growers were always told really to keep their rates up to mitigate against risk, when really now we're looking to tailor the dose according to your situation. And that relates back to that disease triangle we looked at previously. So using minimum effective doses, but also balanced mixtures. Now, balanced mixtures it's a challenge. What is a balanced mixture? Certainly it's, you use a tank mix partner, you may use it for resistance risk management, but you also may use it for broadening a spectrum of control. And again, using one application of a product, that will actually provide a level of balance to your mixture. Mixing and alternations reduce risk. So alternating with different modes of action, the key to being successful. And there is evidence that no significant difference between either approach regarding the rate selection is available. And there has been a program that's been run by Neil Pavley, an industry-led program that's been funded by the AHDB over the past, it ran for about 4 years. And that really suggested that limiting by total dose may be an effective way forward and allow greater flexibility. Next slide, please. Now look at the practical situation for Septoria control today, and actives go through a stage. All actives go through this stage. Now we look at the phase 0 of the QII. This is what Inatreq is. It's a quinolinide inhibitor. It's a new target site of activity for cereals, and at this point in time we see no evidence of resistance, but over time it will occur. We would kid ourselves if we said it wouldn't occur, but what we're looking to do is to extend the practical lifespan of the product. And we see that with SDHIs at this point in time. We have areas where SDHIs they have declined over when they were first came to market, but they've been on the market for 20 years, and they're still a highly successful group of chemistry. And then we look at Triazoles and Strobolurins. I think the cases for Triazoles and Strobes are very, very clear. If you were to increase the rates over and above what you are able to do, you would still get that control level back, but there's certainly a decline in the control, which I know that Aoife will discuss later on in this session. But they still form a very effective level of partnership for new actives coming forward. And then we get to the regression stage. So next slide, please. So what steps really do we use to extend the life of new actives? I mean, this again at Corteva was really key for us. We were very aware as we were coming towards market that the number of multi-sites available was declining. The effectiveness of multi-sites was also not quite what it was originally. So you're looking really for alternation with new modes of with different modes of action. Mixing with different modes of action, reducing that exposure time by just having one application, recommending one application. That's really the best method of reducing that exposure time. And also what we've done over the past few years is really look at how we, what rates we use, how we tailor a rate to the grower's situation, to the grower's variety, their location, geographic location. And by sharing that rate flexibility, it allows the lowest use rates for the situation to be applied and address that situation. However, we have to be mindful that even though we've done all these, we put these, let's say, 4 pillars in place, we won't prevent resistance occurring. When you're dealing with a single site mode of action, you will always have an issue of resistance. But what we're looking to do is to extend the life of a product so it's successful for the farmers and has a successful life, and is also a good tool to be able to use. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, John. That was most useful. Yeah, I picked up quite interesting point. You're saying low dose rates are okay. So hopefully, we'll come back to that in the question times, because that's something that's interesting that, for decades we've been told avoid reduced rates. But yes. Let's move on to Julian Gibbons. Now, Julian farms in Hampshire, and he's compared some of these new products over the last few years on his farm. So it'd be interesting to see, what results he's come from. So over to you, Julian.
Hi. That said, we farm in Hampshire with my brother. We're a mix of chalky soils and clay with flints, and we usually grow around about 200 hectares of wheat. We have about 900 mil of rain a year. And that actually seems to, the rolling average has increased in the last 40 years on a steady upward trend. We suffer generally wet weather diseases. So our key things, Septoria in wheat, Rinco in barley. In choosing wheat varieties, we start with the market and then disease and standing ability. We can de-risk. I like to think I'm a lazy farmer who likes to sleep at night. So we de-risk, if at all possible, by eliminating the unnecessary risks. So we generally don't grow yellow rust varieties, and we don't grow varieties with poor standing abilities. Just we can get rid of those to start off with and help de-risk. We've used multi-sites really. If we look for our spray records, probably certainly the last 38 years, we probably had multi-sites used reasonably regularly through tank mixes and all that time. And the last 5 years, we've been using SDHIs at T1 and T2, and disease control has generally been pretty good until 2021. The key thing to note about 2021, of course, is none of us had chlorthalonil to use. 2021 also had a much higher disease pressure, And I think generally we weren't quick enough to react to that and increase our rates. Anyway, the last 5 years, from 2017 through to 2021, we've trialed the Innotrek active in the mix that appears in Univoc with prothioconazole. It's always been trialed against our farm standard, which has changed as new SDHIs have appeared. So in 2017, it was against Aviator, and then we progressed to Latazera, and then Ascra, and then last year against Revistar. In all the previous 4 years, though, we'd had chlorthalonil always used at T0 and T1, and in many cases used at T2 as well. And 2021, we didn't use a multicide. From 2017 to 2020, generally, with tramline trials, you couldn't really say there was much difference in yield between Univoc and the SDHI containing fungicides. There, in some years, one was a little bit higher, and another year, the other one was a little bit higher. In 2021, we used it against Revistar, and whereas our previous yields have been around about 10 ton over the previous 4 years, last year was 8.2 in the south. We had a lot less sunshine, but also a lot more disease. But as I said, no multi-site. So I do have a feeling we probably underestimated the value of the chlorthalonil in those mixes we'd always had in the past. And we probably have to reevaluate use of multi-sites for future. We are currently growing X-Days and Graham because without chlorthalonil, Septoria has become much higher up in choosing varieties. And looking to the future, we'll probably look at something like KWS Dorsum to add for next season. The other thing that really noted from last year is where we got suckered in to spraying T1 slightly early because the weather's good. You're not doing anything else. It might start raining. And it was very noticeable where we had a 5-week gap compared to a 4-week gap. There was an 8% drop in yield. And actually, we probably found that the Revistar slightly outperformed the Univoc, where the gap was longer. But I hesitate to say, normally we would keep the gap down between 3 and 4 weeks, certainly never more than 4 weeks. And that was, hands up, that's our mistake. Going forward, the beauty of for us as with having a different active is actually in 2021, if we'd been smarter, we could have probably gone back in where we'd used Univoc at T2 with a top-up SDHI at T3, which would have dealt with some of the mycotoxin risk if you'd had one with prothio in, and would have boosted up the Septoria. And I think we probably would have seen a response from that, because certainly our disease levels last year, we have FERA tend to take samples from our crops every year, and most years the disease control is really good. We haven't had, unfortunately, we've not had the results from last year, but I can see them. That's a major drop in yield because of those. But it's the other thing, we can generally spray our wheats in a day and a little bit. We used to have some ground that was 60-mile round trip, and there your attitude to risk and the robustness of your fungicide program is probably slightly is higher, because it's harder to get there. And in fact, when you get a variety breakdown like we had with Robigus many years ago to yellow rust, suddenly having ground that's an hour away and you don't know what the weather's like when you get there is a big cause concern. And and unfortunately we do get varieties breakdown. We were 20% down on wheat yields last year, except for our Group 3 wheats, particular Firefly, where we were actually 40% down on our average for Group 3s last year. So in the best will in the world, sometimes nature will just throw things at you, and you have to be ready for it. But that's unfortunately, that's a lot of the arable farmer. And that's me done, I think.
Okay, great, Julian. That's interesting. That again, that prompts a few questions about the use of multi-sites, and obviously without no CTL, other things are a bit more expensive. And I remember, John, you talked about use of multi-sites as an early circuit breaker, so that could be something we start off with questions later. But let's move on to our third speaker, Dr. Aoife Driscoll, who's head of crop protection and agronomy specialist at NIAB. And Aoife will be looking at the importance of varieties and how fungicide sensitivity or their effectiveness has shifted in recent years. So over to you, Aoife.
Yep, thanks you, David. I'm just waiting for my slides to appear on the screen. Cool. Yeah, so thank you, David. And that was really, really good, Julian, to start us off there, looking at the whole spectrum of what's happening on your farm. So next slide, please. So I thought I'd look at kind of the whole kind of integrated pest management for Septoria, so looking at varietal resistance and fungicide sensitivity. And I guess two major things we're battling with any pathogen, whether it's rusts or mildews or anything else. You're battling really virulence, so that's the ability of the pathogen to overcome the host resistance or the crop resistance, and then fungicide sensitivity. So that's the Septoria able to overcome the abilities of the fungicide to take care of the pathogen. The big thing we're really battling with Septoria is its very, very long latent period. So it can be anywhere from 14 days up to 28 plus days. And there are rare cases out there where it can range from 11 days up to 35 days. But kind of standard is anywhere between 2 weeks and 4 weeks for the latent period. Where you have shorter latent periods, like in some cases we're seeing last year, what that means is you get more disease cycles. And in years like we had last year, you can get up to 6 cycles in a season. Now, why is that important? First of all, it's important in terms of fungicide timings, because shorter latent periods, shorter life cycles means it's really difficult to target your fungicide to tackle the pathogen. And then second of all, if you have more cycles in a season, so it's cycling faster through the crop, you're basically giving that pathogen 6 chances to mutate. And that's driving the virulence, it's driving the ability of the pathogen to overcome the crop resistance, and also driving fungicide sensitivity. So we're really trying to reduce the chances for that Septoria to mutate and overcome all the things we're throwing at it. So the overall aim of a really good IPM strategy for Septoria is to reduce the inoculum, so keep the initial inoculum down out of the crop, and then slow down disease progression, so slow down the number of cycles that it happens in a season, and that will overall reduce the opportunities for Septoria to adapt to the varieties that you sow and the fungicides that you use. And then how do we do that in the field? So next slide, please. And we do that with a couple of different tools. So first of all is your variety choice. And this is both the variety that you choose and also the number of varieties that you grow. So this will create like a diverse kind of multi-gene obstacle course. So imagine you've got an obstacle course with lots of different resistance genes and lots of different types of traits going on there to stop the Septoria moving through the variety or the varieties that you sow. So it stops the pathogen or it slows down the pathogen through the season. And then once you've sown your varieties, you get all these different risk factors. So some of them are in your control and some of them aren't. So you can choose sowing dates. You can kind of, I guess, to some point choose the nitrogen that you put on and how you control your canopy or canopy management. Min tail is a big driver as well of Septoria, as well as yellow rust and brown rust. But the one thing we can't control is the weather. So all these factors will affect the rate of infection and the pace of disease progression. And this is when your cavalry come in, your fungicides. And your fungicides will act as your cavalry in terms of you can have a small cavalry, so maybe one one or two cavalries coming in, or else you can have the curative situation as well, where you get a lot of cavalry coming in. And so the protectant fungicides are in there to keep that inoculum base low. And what you really don't want to be getting into is having to get those large cavalries out to reduce established disease infection. So what we do, we try to use our varieties and use our management tools early on in the season to stop the disease progression or slow down the pathogen as it gets through the crop. But if things like weather get out of control and you lose track of the pathogen, you have your cavalry there as protectants and curatives. So next slide, please. So I suppose this is interesting based on we know what happens in our own regional areas. So Julian talked a lot about he's growing a lot of X-Days and a lot of Graham, not growing much Firefly anymore. So we do tend to know what's happening in our own areas. But what about the national picture? And a lot of talk last year about some varieties not performing as well as they should have. Even things like X-Days, as well as things like Firefly and a lot of the varieties with Cougar and their parentage. But I think this is really interesting to look at from the point of view of actually there wasn't quite a lot of change in terms of the percentage market share from what we saw in 2020. So yes, big increase in X-Days there from 12.3 up to 15.4, and Graham as well, another all reliable, and Crusoe and Costello still looking very good in there. But also we've seen newer varieties also taking good proportions. So things like Cranium, Dawson, Parkham, really good, strong varieties that we think of as not causing you much of a headache. So they're really robust and resilient to lots of different pests and pathogens, and really stable varieties. And then also there's a lot of interest in heritage wheats, so moving back to older varieties, as well as blends and intercropping with legumes, for example, as IPM tools. So just looking at the national picture, I think it's really interesting from some of the stories we were hearing last year about certain varieties being dropped or not performing as well as they should have. Overall, the national picture is looking quite good. So next slide, please. In terms of sensitivity, so this is some work done in an ATB fund project. So from Bart Fry, used to be at Rothamsted, he's at NIAB now. And what we're looking at here is some data on fungicide sensitivity. So Bart has been doing these studies for over 20 years now. And we've got two graphs here. And if you've not seen these graphs before, basically what they're telling you is on the bottom axis, we have what's called an EC50. So this is the amount of the fungicide, so Prothiodestatio or mefentrifluconazole, which is Revysol. And the further right that these dots go, the more fungicide is needed to kill off the isolate. So each of these dots is an individual isolate of Septoria. So the further right means that there's more fungicide needed to kill them off. The isolates are less sensitive. And what we can look at here really is, first of all, the shifts that have happened over the last 20 years. So if we look at, say, in Prothiodestatio, that has had quite a large shift since 2003. But in the last couple of years, so 2019, 2020, and 2021, we have seen a shift, but overall the shift hasn't been as fast as has normally occurred in the past. And yes, we know prothioconazole, we've talked about it a lot the last year. It has shifted quite a lot, and it is worrying, especially as Prothio is in a lot of the mixes that we use in current co-formulations. But then looking at Revysol, you can see there it's quite stable, and it hasn't really shifted that much over the since 2019 and 2020 and 2021. So it is something to think about in terms of the Prothio, what's going to happen there going forwards, especially as it is in a lot of the co-formulated products that we use. But in terms of the overall sensitivity of the azoles, it has stabilized a lot over the last couple of years. And that's really positive, I think, to take from this is, the stability there in the azole sensitivity. Now, this is last year's data. So this is the population of Septoria that you would have sprayed into last March, last April. The data from the autumn sensitivity screens from last September, October, and the early season data from this year will be available in the springtime. I've seen some of that already, and it actually looks really good. So we're in a really, really good place with the azole sensitivity data, and we need to try and keep it that way as best as we can. So next slide, please. The other thing to think about is cross resistance. So just if you could do the animation there as well. So two things to look at here are, so this is again is looking at cross resistance between the different azole chemistries. So prothioconazole, epoxy, Revysol, and tebuconazole. And again, it looks quite complicated, but we'll break it down into two bits. So each of these dots is an isolate of Septoria. And the straighter the line is, the more cross-resistant the two azoles are. So the first two here, the prothio and the epoxyconazole and the Revysol and the tebuconazole, they're very straight lines, but they also have a very high R squared value. So this is the circles here in green. So a higher R squared value and a very straight line means there's a high level of cross-resistance, whereas the Revysol with the prothio and the prothio tebuconazole, they're either very little cross-resistance or there are two separate populations like it is in there with the prothio and the tebuconazole. And again, it's that information is available, it's public, it's independent data. We have all this available to us to kind of help us decide on our management practices. And also it's there to help you think about products that you're using in the field. So we know that we mix prothio with tebuconazole, for example. The reason we do that is because there's no cross-resistance between them. They're two different populations. So yeah, it's really, really good, valuable data and something we should use going forward a bit more, I think, especially with the availability of new actives. So moving on to the SDHIs, next slide, please. SDHI sensitivity, so this again is Bart's work from the AHDB project, and we tend to present the results here just from bixafen, but it's highly relevant to other SDHIs available, so Mtrex, fluxaperoxide, isopyrazam and solatenol as well. And again, like we saw last time, the further right the EC50 goes, the more fungicide is needed to control each of the isolates. And yeah, we are seeing big shifts there in the SDHIs, but overall, again, similar to the 2020 and 2021 populations, there hasn't been much of a shift. In fact, it looks like it's kind of gone back. And again, looking at, from what I've seen from the autumn data and the spring data, it looks really promising. You know, we have seen big shifts, but the fact that it's stabilizing, we need to try and keep it that way as much as possible. But we do have issues there in terms of new SDHIs coming to the market, so things like Adjuvants and Iblon going forwards, and how will that resistance affect current and new SDHIs going forwards. And then last slide, kind of messages for 2022. The main message, I think, from what we were hearing from farmers really, it was that it's not about varieties breaking down and fungicides stopping working. The varieties and the fungicides don't change. The pathogen evolves. So Septoria is evolving. And those changes that we see, so changes in virulence and fungicide sensitivity, they're driven largely, not all, by overuse or misuse of individual components. That's where your integrated pest management comes in. Your varieties, your agronomy, and your fungicide use. So not overusing or misusing any individual components. It's really good that we have new modes of action, so the QII within Intrec, but also newer SDHIs going forwards as well. And the positive to take, I think, is those indications we saw earlier of slowdowns in resistance. So the slowdown there in bixafen in particular and azole resistance is something we really need to take advantage of going forwards. And we do have to worry because new chemistry is coming into pre-selected populations. So populations that have already been selected for azole or SDHI resistance. Around varieties, you know, we really need to strive for diversity. So create that obstacle course as best as you can. Create that wall, bring loads of diversity in, loads of different genes, and spread your risk. Don't rely on one variety. You know, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. The FRAG guidelines haven't changed. Their FRAG lines are still the same. So you need to use all your available chemistry, lowest rates, appropriate rates with suitable mixture partners. But what has changed is the chemistry available to us. So how do we use those FRAG guidelines for managing resistance with the new tools that we have available to us going forwards? And I think it's going to get really interesting over the next couple of years with all the new chemistry that's coming onto the market and how we incorporate that into programs. So that's it. Thank you, David.
Great, thanks, Aoife. That's very interesting. Yeah, a bit of good news there, really. A bit of slowdown in resistance, and a few new products coming along. So you know, we all need a bit of good news. But you know, interesting those charts on azoles and SDHI. So that might be interesting. Do you rotate azoles? Do you rotate SDHIs? Those are always questions I ask myself. But let's move on. Let's move on now to Nick Anderson, who's head of crop technology at Velcourt. Now, Nick's company farms an awful lot of land in England and Scotland, so it'd be interesting to hear what he has to say on his resistance strategies on his crops. So over to you, Nick.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Really enjoyed listening to the three preceding speakers. Thank you. That's been really interesting. Hopefully, I won't go over too much of the same ground again. I think from where Velcourt is at, the key is integrated management, and that's whether we're talking about managing fungicide resistance or any other aspect of crop protection. I think it's essential for us as an industry that we take a properly integrated approach and indeed shout about that, because it's demonstrates the responsible way in which we're approaching crop production. So what does that mean for us? Well, obviously varieties, and I'll give you our sort of take on that in a moment. Sowing date, timeliness of application, something Julian touched on there. Being out in the field and really making sure that we're hitting the right growth stages, protecting the correct leaf layers, and good crop scouting to ensure that we're using proportionate rates of fungicide, appropriate rates in the field. And I think there's something interesting to talk about there in terms of developing technologies that can help support those decision-making processes. And then finally, that brings us on to the fungicides themselves, which are very much the final piece of the jigsaw for us. Obviously, using appropriate combinations of fungicides, sequences of fungicides, alternating modes of action, and the value of the additional multi-sites where appropriate. So, as I say, that is the final piece of the jigsaw as far as I'm concerned. So, to pick up on the point about variety, a point of nuance that I thought I'd just highlight is it's easy to look at the recommended list and be drawn by untreated yield in choosing varieties and steer clear of varieties with low untreated yield. Similarly, going around variety trials, it's the eye is easily drawn by varieties that are susceptible to yellow rust and very, very visible for having desiccated leaves in trial plots. But in fact, we tend to focus on Septoria resistance rather than looking exclusively at untreated yield data, for the reason that Septoria is the battleground rather than yellow rust, in my view. Perhaps differ slightly from Julian in that opinion. I'm not suggesting for one moment this would be good practice, but if you sprayed a crop of a susceptible yellow rust variety, perhaps Iat, 4 times with tebuconazole, you probably wouldn't see any yellow rust, and you would have change out of £20 a hectare. So it's a relatively cheap disease to manage when you consider that our fungicide programs might be well in excess of £100, and that difference is spent on Septoria control. So the point that I'm making there is the importance of focusing on Septoria resistance from a financial point of view, especially given that's probably the disease that year on year costs us the most from poor control as well. And indeed, that's something which our own fungicide variety interaction work has sort of shown quite clearly as well. SY and Cita would be a good example of a variety that, if you look at the untreated yield on the recommended list, it's I think 78% of the control mean. Yet we found that by controlling yellow rust in that variety, you can grow it very cheaply. So it shows the importance of differentiating where that fungicide response is coming from. sowing date is a really interesting point, because inevitably, when you have a large area to drill in the autumn, there's going to be a degree of compromise there. So I think it's important to be intelligent in terms of where you position your varieties. At the AHDB conference the year before last, Jonathan Blake put up a really interesting piece of work, I thought, that showed that a 1 month delay in drilling date effectively equates to a 3-point increase in Septoria resistance score. So by positioning those varieties with a lower resistance to Septoria at the end of drilling programs, positioning the more resistant varieties at the front, hopefully we can manage to mitigate some of the issues with weaker varieties. And on that point, I'll just touch on yellow rust there. Obviously, yellow rust can be considered in that process as well. Yellow rust is actually the risk of yellow rust is increased by late sowing and reduced by early sowing. So actually, positioning those varieties with perhaps a greater resistance to Septoria, but a greater susceptibility to yellow rust at the front of programs is good IPM on both fronts, really. I mentioned good scouting and some of the developing technologies that we have perhaps to help support us in the decisions that we're making in fields around fungicide use. It's important to be using fungicides in a protectant situation as far as possible, and to be using appropriate field rates in relation to whether you're in a protectant or an eradicant situation. Something which I think is really interesting is the development of qPCR for helping inform those decisions. And I suggest it's something which is in development yet, and there are a number of questions around, but I certainly hope that that's something which we can use more in the future to help guide us in those decision-making processes. Some of the preliminary trials work that we've done in Belcourt, looking at the Swift Detect service, has indicated quite a good correlation between measured latent Septoria in the leaf, so Septoria that's in the leaf but can't actually be seen visibly, and then observed Septoria 3 weeks later. So that looks quite promising, albeit that there are potentially questions and challenges around, for example, the spatial distribution of Septoria actually in the field, and the intensity and frequency of sampling that will be needed. And then a final sort of a point that I was going to make was around blends, which Aoife touched on, but that's something that I can see being really quite interesting in the future. Certainly our own variety work, which has included blends for a couple of years, suggests that we get some sort of out-yielding benefit, by which the performance of blended varieties is greater than that of the individual components of the blend, and I can see for feed wheat growers that being quite a useful and interesting way of mitigating risk in the future, and something I'd be interested to hear the views of the rest of the panel on as well. So perhaps, David, it'd be good to hear some questions from the audience.
Yes. Oh, thanks very much. Very interesting. Your focus on Septoria, in wheat, because basically it's the most costly to control. We can all control yellow rust, or hopefully we can, if tebuconazole keeps us going. But let's have a look at some of the questions coming in, and I'm going to try and direct these to the appropriate people, but just jump in if you think you need to or would like to make a comment. How can tank mix adjuvants help us avoid the risk of resistance regarding reduction of required active dosage? Perhaps can I direct that at Aoife, do you think? tank mix adjuvants. What are your thoughts on that?
I think I might leave that one to John, just because it's yeah, I think I'll leave that one to John, but I can take some of the other ones for sure.
Okay, fine. Okay.
Yeah, it's with adjuvants. Typically, when you have a formulated product, you've got a fully optimized formulation, and the addition of extra adjuvant is simply not required. It can compromise and overwet your product. So, I mean, certainly for our point of view, from Corteva and Univoc, and we would say you do not need additional adjuvant. We have a formulation that has the patented delivery matrix, and certainly if we add adjuvant to that, we are seeing a detrimental effect.
Yeah, I'd agree with you there, and that one especially, John, because the formulations are just so good. There's been such good advances over the last couple of years, but I can see the point of the question, but I don't think it will make a difference, especially for how good the new products are coming onto the market.
Perhaps worth noting that wasn't always the case, and you consider, for example, epoxyconazole historically, and the benefits you got from it. You know, the addition of morpholine with that, because it increases the speed of uptake. But you know, newer products are more better formulated, and you don't tend to see that so much.
I think it depends on the pathogen as well, the pathogen that you're dealing with. So for something like a mildew, you could see why adding more adjuvant might make a difference. But for something like a Septoria, I wouldn't see that helping the situation.
Right, and another question, perhaps I can direct this at Eva. This might be the real one for you. With the sensitivity shift of prothioconazole, are we likely to see the similar sort of shift in Revysol when it gets used and has greater exposure?
I would say the answer to that is that we will. It's almost a given that we will see shifts to products, but it's how fast that shift occurs. Whether it's going to be 1 year or 5 years or 10 years, we can't really predict that at the moment. But yeah, short answer, to any product that gets used quite a lot, we will see shifts in sensitivity. But the big point is how fast that shift occurs.
Great, thanks. And another question: when new products are brought to the market, what can manufacturers do to try and limit this resistance building up? Perhaps one for you, John, again.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, as I said before, the ultimate would be restricted the number of applications. You know, that's by far the I would say simplest and most effective way of extending the product life cycle. But you know, the challenge that we have and we're faced with at the moment is we have significant regulatory pressure on products. So we are losing significant numbers of products that we're able to rotate with. Now we have new products coming onto market over the coming years, and there will be also good tools, let's say, for farmers to use. But you know, if there's a restriction or let's say more sensible use of doses as well, I think that's the way forward. That's really what I was saying about tailoring the dose to the situation.
So I think, John, it's a very good answer there, and I agree with you on that. And I think it's really sensible as well with the Innitrek that you've gone for the one application. Yeah, and I see this with new products as well coming on the market. Restricting to a single is probably the best way, really, that we have of ensuring good resistance management.
And that was part of the issue, certainly for us in 2021, that actually we didn't up the dose rates in light of what the weather we'd seen. We need to be a little bit smarter on that, really. I think it's just getting suckered in from having a number of years with very little disease and really good disease control.
Yeah, so okay. I think 2021 was, you know, a good case in point. The last significant Septoria years was probably, well, maybe 2012. So it's been a long time, and I think growers get used to cutting the rate back. Ultimately, the also aim is to return over input. And I think last year it just people just got caught out. It probably, dare I say, there's an element of complacency in that people have a relatively short memory. They always think back to the previous year. And moving forward again, it's really just tailor the dose according to the situation. If you're in a high risk situation, bring that rate up. If not, for argument's sake, if you're over in let's say the west of the country, if you're in Ireland, your risk against Septoria is much greater than if you're over in East Anglia, let's say, and just adjust that dose accordingly.
Great, thanks very much. And we've got another question here. With prothioconazole as the mixing partner of Inatrec, what are the challenges regarding resistance? Perhaps I better throw this one to you, John, again.
The issue is, again, we've reduced the number of applications of apicolinamide to 1. Okay, so the prothioconazole is there to boost broad spectrum activity, but also within the formulation matrix, we do get a boost of the prothioconazole performance anyway. So, it's really what I came on to right at the start is, how do you balance a mixture? It's very difficult to balance a mixture. The ideal would be you apply your products and they travel around the plant at the same time, protecting each part of the plant at the same time. In reality, that's never going to happen. Prothioconazole, I guess the issue we have moving forward is because we have the regulatory pressures, because we're seeing the triazoles decreasing. Okay, we've got Revysol as a new triazole, but we're seeing regulatory pressure on triazoles. So what we will see is an explosion of prothioconazole coming onto market, and that's something we need to be mindful of. And again, apply the correct dose at the right time and rotate with other modes of action.
And I suppose to back you up a bit there, John, this isn't just a Univoc problem, it's an everyone's problem because it's in so many mixes. So this isn't just an Inatrec thing, this is something to think about across the industry. And the thing about, the curves that we produce, it is prothio-destio, so it is the more active form of prothioconazole. So in terms, you can look at it from the point of view of, it's really bad, but I guess it's mainly just looking at the trends as well, and trends of how fast it's actually happening. But it's an industry-wide problem, so it's not picking out individual products or companies there. We have to think about these things, about life after prothio and tebuconazole, and what we're going to do if we lose them. So 3, 5, 10 years down the line, we do need to be thinking about that. But right now, I think we're in a pretty good place. So yeah, a bit of positivity wouldn't go amiss, I suppose, there on the prothio use. And it is in a lot of programs, not just in wheat and barley too. So it is fun to watch, I think.
I mean, what would be the ideal combination to use, John? I mean, in an ideal world, should we just pick the best SDHI, the best azole, Univoc, and the best multicide and mix them all together, or would that be good or bad?
Well, it's really about using the right product at the right time. I would say that's the key. So you're probably looking to use your multicide early on. Again, it depends on the situation you're at, but you use your product at the right time, mixed with the right different modes of action. Ultimately, you should really probably leave your best chemistry till maybe the T2 position. That's when you're building that yield. It also allows you to more cheaply take out your other pathogens early on in your program. The issue we are faced with now, I think growers have been used to just popping CTL into the tank as a matter of routine because it was cheap, it was very effective. It's not the case now. I mean, Folpit is a very, it's a good multi-site. It doesn't quite have the same level of activity. It's more costly. So it's really just positioning it to where it has the greatest effect.
Yeah, we've got a related question here, a little bit perhaps going over old ground, but as mixed partners become more and more restricted, i.e. presumably talking about chlorthalonil and some of the azoles, what's the best way of mitigating resistance? We've lost CTL, we've lost epoxyconazole, we're losing other things. What's the best way of mitigating resistance when we're losing products?
Well, I think it really comes back to, step right back to the crops that you're growing, the cultivars you're growing, where you're growing them, and how you can disrupt, as I was talking about that disease triangle, how you can disrupt that disease triangle. So you're changing your variety to a more tolerant variety. But again, you've got to have a mixture of varieties. It's not a case of just having one variety and just growing that one variety, because you're just going to end up in problems yourself. And then if we do that, your fungicide program really should be the last part of your defense strategy.
Right, thanks very much, John. Sorry, focusing a little bit on you. Probably another one for you. We've got another question here, which is, sorry to inundate you with so many, but with Inatrec allowing an SDHI-free application, is it not wise to try and limit SDHI applications to one and not push a T3 SDHI azole approach? Because Inatrec Univoc is you can only have one application a year, SDHI is two. So do you think it would be wise to, I'm just paraphrasing, limit the SDHIs to one a season like the Univoc?
To be honest, in an ideal situation, yes, that would be the case, because you have to consider that you also have SDHIs applied as a seed treatment. So, that's not always taken into account. So in effect, you've got three. I mean, it's counted as two, but you've got 3 times within a, you're growing your crop that you have three lots of SDHI. The ultimate would be to have one, but we're also in that situation where, we don't have a huge number of different mode of action or new, target sites available to us, and growers are in they have a challenge.
Yes, I mean that's intriguing. The second SDHI, as Julian was alluding to, that if you do Univoc on your T1 or T2, that means you probably use the SDHI on the other T1 or T2, and it leaves you an SDHI for the T3 if you're in a very bad Septoria year. So I suppose that is a useful option, an expensive option perhaps, but a useful one in a high disease year.
I think, David, it's probably worth pointing out at that stage you just want to be careful of your label restrictions. So Astra, for example, has a label cut-off of growth stage 61. So that would be before you'd be looking to manage Fusarium with a conventional earwash spray. So, that's not going to get carried away with that different.
A little bit of caution there then. Obviously read your labels very carefully. And
I mean, also, you shouldn't really be getting yourself into a situation where you need to use the azoles or the SDHIs and azole application at T3. You're doing all you can to not get there in the first place. I wouldn't worry too much about pushing it. It's trying to keep us out of that situation in the first place.
And I would completely agree with that one. It's a case of getting that dose rate right for that T2.
Yeah.
But it's just, if you have,
it's hard.
You have got that. I won't say get out of jail free card. In 1 year in 10, you might subject to timings. Problem is, of course, in those really high disease years, the timing usually gets away from you.
And we didn't really talk about timings, did we? And with the stuff that happened with timings last year, around people not identifying growth stages properly. And even if they did, the uneven development in the crop just made it really hard. But John was alluding to earlier, you know, a well-timed spray of whatever product that you use will do you well. So we need to be out there dissecting, even though we hate it, some of us, we have to get our timings right. So that's another resistance management tool, is your dissections.
Great, that's great. And I have another question here. Do older azoles such as ciproconazole have a role as a mixing partner to reduce the dependency on prothioconazole? I suppose we're going to have a dependency on prothio and mefentrifluconazole, the Revasol. So we're going to have a reliance on two azoles going forward. So does Cipro, does that give us anything extra?
Ciproconazole has gone, so I think probably the older triazoles we're thinking about now really. Yeah, prothioconazole obviously, but metconazole, there's a sort of a renewed interest in flutriafol as a T0 option, but tebuconazole does nothing on Septoria. So I mean, really, in terms of triazoles with activity on Septoria, you've got Revasol as a new product, Prothio, and Metcon. The other triazoles, in my view, aren't really adding a lot. But be interested in the thoughts from the rest of the panel on that.
Thank you.
And if those are the three that we've got, are they worth rotating? I mean, we talked about, you showed a chart, Aoife, about sensitivity of azoles. What's your thoughts on rotating azoles through a program, using one for T1, one for T2, etc.?
Well, don't forget as well that we have Myrisa, so we do have another azole that we haven't mentioned there. So that is actually an azole product. In terms of rotating, so I completely take your point about tebuconazole not having activity on Septoria. Some people think it does. I don't think it does much personally. I suppose things about rotating azoles is, again, what I showed around cross resistance. So are you taking that into consideration? So we have prothio-tebuconazole mixes. They exist largely in part of those cross resistance patterns. But in terms of rotating azoles for a Septoria program, I think there's much better chemistry available out there now that we can look at. Especially, I mean, we have Myrisa, we have Imtrex, new SDHIs coming on the market. So I think that's probably a better strategy than thinking about rotating azoles.
Okay, thanks very much. And we talked about fungicides a lot. Do biopesticides have a role here?
Keeping that one for me. So my view on those, I think they work really well for pathogens like biotropes, like mildews in particular. But I think for pathogens with longer latent periods that are much more difficult to control, I don't have much faith. The question that I always ask is, what are you trying to achieve? So if anyone's marketing a biopesticide, what's it actually doing? So is it increasing crop health, so it's making it more resilient, or is it actually targeting the disease itself? Is it having a fungicidal effect? Which of those two is it doing? And you can see for things like sulfur, for example, that's actually targeting the fungi itself. That would have a role to play in things like mildew control. But for Septoria, I think it's quite difficult to get anything reliable in the field.
Great, thanks very much. Could I go back to something I mentioned earlier about, I think John mentioned it, about low rates. As I said, we've been told for a number of decades that low rates of fungicides are not the way forward. And you were saying low rates can be good, but so this, I mean, obviously interesting because these new products are quite expensive. So low rates could be the way forward, John.
I would say that low rates, it's all about the dose tailored to your situation. So you're not, constantly putting on a label rate or a 75% dose, but you're tailoring the dose to the situation that you're presented with. So that's really down to, again, going back to that disease triangle, how you're trying to disrupt it. But certainly As you say, David, historically, it's always been keep the rates up. This is the way to mitigate against resistance. But work recently has over the past few years has really shown that by tailoring your dose, cutting that dose down, and you're basically you're not selecting for those resistant pathogens. And certainly, if you historically, if you look to a country such as Denmark, historically they use low dose applications of products, and they typically don't have the same level of resistance that we would do. And they're in it's a maritime region country. They get Septoria badly, but it's something that's it's really about tailoring the dose to your situation, and that's one way of mitigating.
And presumably, as long as we use a good mix, that mitigates it again. If we're using the picalidimides with an azole and with perhaps a multisite, as long as we're using a good mix, that mitigates the risk further, does it?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, great. I think we've probably come to the end of. I think somebody mentioned about heritage wheats and blends. So I just wondered whether anybody might like to comment on that. I can't remember who that was who mentioned blends. I think that was.
I think that was Nick.
Was that Nick? Yes. What do you think that has a future? I mean, the problem with blends is that you might have to change them continually, as new varieties come and old ones go, and to get the maturity dates. But it obviously sounds an interesting approach.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not the answer to everything, and certainly for people who are growing quality wheats or for specific markets, obviously it's not an option. But for the Group 4 growers, I see that it has some potential to mitigate risk. I think there's probably a bit of work to be done to understand how to put them together to the best effect. But there are it's fairly good evidence for the mechanisms by which they work, and good trials evidence for a yield advantage arising from blends over and above pure stands. I think it's something to watch. Is my view. Going to be interested to hear thoughts from the rest of the panel, really.
Have you done much work with blends, Aoife, on your work?
Well, I'm a big fan of blends.
Right.
I'm a big believer in them. In terms of we're dealing with some people who literally grow one variety across their farm, and you just can't do that. Especially like years where we had last year, where if you get Septoria, it'll just rip through your crop. We have to encourage diversity in whatever way we can. So I'm a big believer in blends. I think I do worry a bit about some of the ways that they're being marketed. And we need to think about practically how they will work in the field a bit more. So yeah, I think I agree with Nick totally around the feed wheat market. There's huge potential there, and especially to mix in older varieties as well into those mixes. We are doing some work this year on soft and milling wheats to prove and disprove whether they work, because there are lots of issues there getting these things right. So a good mix might be a Theodore and Costello mix, a two-way mix, because you get the good resistance and then the high spec weight as well. But we have 3- and 4-way mixes as well of soft and milling blends in there. So yeah, absolutely one to watch. But from a pathogen point of view, anything that could slow down the pathogen making its way through the crop, or pests or anything else, has to be a good thing. But yeah, there are lots of things to consider there around, especially if you reuse the seed year on year, and that the best variety will become dominant in the mix. So loads of things to think about, and definitely one to watch.
Great. And you mentioned older wheats there. What's the importance there? Because the older, a lot of people might think the older wheat, so that they faded away because they had very bad resistance to Septoria or yellow rust. But those are still important, are they, in a blend?
I would think so, yeah. I mean, what people are looking for a lot more now is people are looking to lower inputs, and people are looking to there's a lot of people who will look to kind of increase yields, and they're looking to increase inputs, chase yield. But some people want to get the same yields as they've kind of always had, and they're doing really well, but they want to lower their inputs, and that's for lots of different reasons. So yeah, people are going back to look at older varieties. People have become very interested in parental diversity, especially with the year that we've just come through. So the blend selection tool on the HTV website, that allows you to go back to great parentage to look at the parents of your varieties. So we're much more aware of parentage from what we've come through. And then you also have the kind of people are looking to improve resilience and lower inputs overall across the farm. And that's where blends come in. So I think, yeah, there's load of benefits to them for loads of different angles.
Okay, great. Thanks.
The one comment on heritage varieties. I mean, we've grown heritage barley varieties, and you think, oh, they'll do really well with modern fungicides, and actually they do what they did 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
But generally, that's because, of course, as Aoife alluded, your input levels are lower anyway.
And they don't even need to be heritage. I mean, they could be something like a Santiago, which isn't that old, but in the grand scheme of things is quite old. So, yeah, and things like Nelson are another great one coming forward as well. Things that are just really robust and resilient and won't cause you too much of a headache in the season, I think, are becoming a lot more popular.
And going back to the fungicide approach, I mean, is there any sign that we might get another group of fungicides to help us with Septoria? We've got azoles, SDHIs, and now we've got the picolinamides. I mean, ideally, it'd be nice to see, from a resistance point of view, that another group come up that might be useful, a systemic group that might be useful against Septoria. So is there any sign or anything like that happening, John?
We're always looking for stuff.
Yeah,
that's what I would say. We're always looking for stuff. There's the Metastrob that's coming up in the next year or so that lacks the cross resistance with Strobolurins. So there's that one that's looking good. You always have to think that this is a long process. So typically it takes around about 10 to 12 years to get a product to market. You also, if you're looking to mix with that product, you're looking at the mix partner as well to see what's going to be on the market in let's say 10 and 12 years time. So it's difficult, but I would imagine there will be new chemistries coming along. But it's at this point in time, it's really just how we manage what we have at the moment.
And do you think there'll be more from the picolinamide groups? You've obviously produced one product. Do you think it'll be like the SDHIs will have 3, 4, 5, 6?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but there will be other picolinamides, of course. So we would look to develop that chemistry. But again, this is why we've looked to restrict the number of applications. If we burn up Inatrek within the next year or so, then we will affect our progress further down the line. So this is really why we're saying one application of a picolinamide, extend that lifespan, have it as an effective tool for the farmers, and this is a way forward. And I think if we end up with other chemistries being restricted to one application, I think it would put the grower in a better situation.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. It's obviously good news that we've got this new product that we can mix and match a bit better. So with that, I'd probably like to bring this conversation to a close because we've been going for about an hour and a quarter now. So could I just thank all our 4 speakers for their excellent presentations, and all those who've joined us online for this webinar, and for Corteva for supporting Farmers Weekly with this event. I've certainly picked up a few interesting tips on high and low rates of fungicides and rotating fungicides, and the use of older varieties. So just can I reiterate that if you are watching this webinar live or even listening to it, can I repeat that what I said earlier, that to get your basis CPD point, please type your membership number beginning with 200 in the Ask a Question box below. So it all remains for me to thank you all and say goodbye to this presentation. Okay, thank you very much and goodbye.